Hi, I'm Philip Garnett, and for these podcasts, I'm going to look into ideas around systemic failure and complexity theory. And to open it up, this first episode of the podcast is around this concept of the possibility of total systemic failure. And this is based on a paper that I wrote in the Science of the Total Environment titled Total Systemic Failure. And the podcast itself is also based on a talk given at the University of Edinburgh in March 2008 for a workshop on liquid modernity. So there are aspects of complexity theory that link, and systems theory more generally, that link quite strongly with concepts around liquid modernity, and it's a good lens to look at the possibility of whether or not we're going to see large-scale failures of systems in the future. So this episode is based quite strongly on that presentation I made in Edinburgh, and I'll just get sort of straight into it, really. So there are issues raised by aspects of complexity theory, systems thinking, and behaviour of systems that are present in the concept of liquid modernity. Many are discussed to an extent in a paper by Anthony Bryant, which I'll link to at the bottom, and these are things like turbulence and transience. I wonder, however, if there are some potentially significant differences, such as the presence of quasi-stable emergent states, that are discussed more in complex systems theory. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the podcast really is take you through the background to things like general systems theory, complex systems theory, and this notion of systemic failure and whether or not we should be worrying about it. And then link this to some ideas of liquid modernity. So with its roots in scientific disciplines, systems theory is a way of describing phenomena as a set of interrelated and interdependent parts. A system would normally be described by its purpose or nature, or expressed in terms of its function, and systems can be delineated from other systems by their spatial and temporal boundaries. Although they are influenced by their environments, which would obviously contain other systems, it is more common now to think of a system boundary as semi-permeable or fuzzy boundaries between systems and their environment. So where we would delineate previously systems with a kind of quite firm boundary, now with complex systems thinking and more recent systems thinking, the idea of being able to separate systems has kind of disappeared. So it's recognised that it's difficult to draw a clear boundary around anything, but it's often useful to do so, particularly for reasons of computational tractability. So a good example of this is something like a cellular system. So you can see a cell on the slide and the different components of that system and that interact to form the basis of the cell. So it's often intuitive to think of a system as composed of two entities, the first being objects or parts, such as the people in an organisation, and the second the relationships between those parts, perhaps a management structure. To take another example of the living cell that you can see, the boundary of the system would be the cell membrane, and the parts the proteins, DNA, RNA, amino acids, sugars, and other cell structures. The regulatory networks are the interactions between those parts, and together they determine the nature of the cell and its function. The nature and function of the cell can also be referred to as the system state or the system behaviour, and that system state could be relatively stable, at least while the cell is alive. So we can return to stability later. A significant contribution of Bertalanffy to systems theory is the idea of open systems. Open systems, as opposed to closed systems, exchange mass with their environment as well as energy. Bertalanffy proposed that the concept of open systems is more applicable to biological systems such as biological organisms, as they are able to exchange materials into and out of their environment. He would argue that they have the capacity to maintain a steady state. Perhaps this would suggest that open systems are therefore illiquid, as they display a good degree of stability. This is something that I would not necessarily wholly agree with. General systems theory is largely, or not fully, positivist. It was thought by some that should it be possible to list all the parts of a system and all their interactions, it would be possible to then predict all the potential behaviours of that system. Therefore, should we be able to list all the parts of a cell and all the interactions between those parts, we could predict all the possible functions of that cell, given enough computational capacity. Any discrepancy between the model system and the real system would be due to a mischaracterization of the parts of the system or their interactions. The complexity of a system is therefore largely due to the number of parts and the myriad possible interactions. The possibility that this is the case has not gone away, and many biologists rigorously map gene regulatory networks in the hope that cells will give up all their secrets. Complex systems theory differs here in a number of respects, and this is one reason why it's not universally welcomed in scientific communities. Complex systems theory proposes that a system is still composed of a set of interrelated and interdependent parts. However, complexity theory would propose that it's not possible to predict the system behavior or state from an enumeration of the parts and their interactions alone, as the system behavior is actually an emergent property of the interactions between the parts, often articulated as the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Complex systems theory is therefore less reductive than systems theory, and this difference presents many challenges. If we take a simple complex system like the cellular autonomer of Conway's gain of life, here the system is a grid where each cell can either be white, dead, or black, alive, and there are a simple set of rules which determine how a cell changes from one state to the other. And the rules are as follows. Any live cell with fewer than 2 live neighbours dies, as if caused by underpopulation. Any live cell with 2 or 3 live neighbours lives on to the next generation. Any live cell with more than 3 live neighbours dies as if by overcrowding. Any dead cell with exactly 3 live neighbours becomes a live cell as if by reproduction. This simple set of 4 rules produces a range of complex emergent behaviours that we would not be able to predict from the rules themselves. It's only through observing the system and arranging cells in different starting conditions can you observe all the different possible behaviours. Complex systems have a number of other features that have consequences for how they behave, and a number of these have an impact on how the systems might fail. Emergence, so we have seen examples of emergence already, and self-organisation is quite similar. Homeostasis or systems inertia. Systems frequently demonstrate resilience to external factors or forces, and therefore a change in the environment may not produce a change in the system. Similarly, a change with an interaction with another system may also have no demonstrable impact on system behaviour. This suggests a degree of stability. A system can have the capacity to maintain itself in a changing environment. The example of a cell would be a good one. Cells can adapt to changing environment within limits. One problem with complex systems is that once the limit of the resilience of a system is exceeded, it is difficult to predict what might then happen. A relatively small change in pH, for example, would have the capacity to kill many types of cells. Next feature, adaptation. Systems have a self-adapting capacity. They're able to make internal changes that maintain the system behavior or purpose, perhaps in response to a changing environment or a changing interaction with another system. Feedback. Internal feedbacks regulate the system, allow it to self-correct in response to other systems or the environment. Memory. As systems change through time, the prior states influence the current state. This could result in a spontaneous failure, or failure without cause, or spontaneous recovery, or hysteresis, where a change in a system is significantly more difficult to reverse than it was to progress to. This may be the case for climate change, where reversing the steady warming of the environment requires a disproportionately large effort. This is one place where complexity theory crosses paths with tipping points, as a tipping point might suggest a radical shift to a new state that is hard to reverse. Complex systems are non-linear, and therefore a perturbation might cause a massive change, or a proportional change, or no change at all. This feature of the behaviour of systems again has consequences for how systems might fail, as it adds to the difficulty of predicting the response of a system to change. One might hope that an ecosystem, for example, under pressure, would respond in a linear way to the pressure exerted on it. However, it is entirely possible that for a while the ecosystem would demonstrate little or no measurable response before a change in the pressure causes the ecosystem to fail entirely. These features present a challenge to understanding how any given system is going to behave, particularly in a changing environment. This presents a significant issue when it comes to understanding failure. Failure of complex systems is not well understood. Either how complex systems fail or what failure looks like from either within the system or from the outside. Failure could occur in a number of ways. A system could either spontaneously fail, suffer a cascade failure that moves through the system or even across multiple systems, or undergo a slow change in state that might represent failure to us, but is in fact just part of a process of adaptation or change, and not really a failure from the point of view of the system. Temporality is a significant contributing factor to how we understand systems, as the temporal scale that a system might be responding to could be highly variable. Changes that are seen in systems could be in response to forces that occurred a significant amount of time ago from the point of view of the observer. The last aspect of complexity theory that we will discuss is that of complex networks. Complex network theory is, among other things, an intuitive way of visualizing a system, as the parts of the system and their interactions map directly onto the nodes and edges of a graph. The objects of the system, such as the parts of a cell or the individuals in a social network, map to the nodes in a graph. The relationships between the parts, such as friendships between individuals in a social network, are the edges connecting the nodes. In the example image, the circles represent individuals within the different organizations and the edges represent contacted. The weight of the edge represents number of times contact has been made. This complex network could then be used to understand how information might flow through the network of people and other information about this community. Analysis could be done to discover communities within the network based on the number and weight of the connections between individuals, and the edges also provide an indication of whom the important connectors are in the network. Complex networks therefore map well onto how we understand complex systems, and also provide a way of investigating the behaviour of complex systems either analytically or computationally. Components of a system may fail regularly, but due to the adaptive nature of systems, it can have little or no impact on the system as a whole. Systemic failure describes a process where a system, or perhaps system of systems, reaches a point, either through forcings from the external environment or internal dynamics, that the system behaviour can no longer be maintained, and the whole system collapses and essentially ceases to be. A system that is suffering a large number of failures of parts or the relationships between them might undergo systemic failure, as either enough of the parts of the systems will have disappeared or the relationships broken that the system cannot regulate or maintain its own internal dynamics. This could be the situation that a number of environmental, ecological, and social systems find themselves in today. The problem is, for all the reasons stated, we are not very good at predicting when, or indeed if, that might happen. For large complex global systems, it could already have happened, but we might just not be able to perceive it yet. If we accept that global or Earth systems have all the features of complex systems and complex networks, then this presents a problem. One way to think of planetary or global systems is a system of systems. That is a large number of highly connected systems that are in some ways thought of as discrete, but are in fact highly connected, and that the behaviour of a system is dependent on, or at least influenced by, the other systems it's connected to. The strength and nature of this influence might be, and is quite likely to be, unknown. Therefore, we must now add in the additional complexity of how the connectivity between systems could cause changes in one system or trigger failure in another, which may result in a cascade failure across the entire system. Loss of nodes or edges in the networks might have unpredictable effects, both within systems but also across systems. This is an additional challenge to our understanding of how systems fail, as in addition to systems being resilient to a point, exhibiting non-linear responses, and also having the possibility to undergo spontaneous failure, we now have to consider that how these operate together across tightly coupled systems of systems. The diagram shows two toy systems that due to the nature of the relationships or edges between the parts, or nodes, can be thought of as discrete but connected. One on the left, one on the right. There are also a number of nodes that have relationships with nodes that are considered part of the other system, shown as lines drawn across from a node to one system to one in the next. This is a simplified version of what might be called a system of systems. The two systems as a whole can be thought as one system with one emergent global behaviour, but also as two connected systems, each with their own behaviour. Failure of one node will have a knock-on effect in the other connected system, and the failure could spread across the systems in unpredictable ways. Potentially, a small number of failures in one system could cause a systemic failure in another, which then ultimately causes the systemic failure of both systems. The video shows a failure spreading out from one node in one system, but quickly spreads to both systems. The speed at which it spreads and how it spreads is dependent on the relationship between the parts. How this happens in much larger, more complex systems is not easy to determine. This type of failure has potentially serious consequences for how we view our own global system as systems. The Earth. Take, for example, climate change. Some view climate change as a slow, relatively modest rising of mean global temperatures, which could be viewed as relatively insignificant, as a half, 1 or even 3 degrees change in a temperature really that problematic. Systemic failure of complex systems and systems of systems would suggest, along with lots of other data, that assuming a linear response to a few degrees of warming would be extremely unwise. There are not a great many examples of large-scale system failure that we can point to, however there are some. Perhaps one of the most obvious examples where it could be argued systemic failure was rather narrowly avoided is the recent banking crisis. Failures among banks in 2008 and 2009 looked like the beginning of a cascade failure of the banking system, triggered, in part at least, by the decision to allow Lehman Brothers Bank to fail. This single but significant failure triggered a non-linear response in an already highly distressed banking system, a response that then required a large input of money to arrest. This, therefore, is an example of a non-linear response in a complex systems of systems, and perhaps an example of a system displaying a degree of hysteresis, as the effort required to arrest the crash has been significant and we are still reversing it. What if all systems are failing? The possibility that all systems are failing should not be dismissed, particularly at a point where there might be something that could be done about it, as it has not yet happened. We have seen that complex systems, complex networks, and systems of systems fail in unpredictable ways. Therefore, in one system can induce failure in another. Systems can fail on their own, and so on. Temporality also has a significant role. A system could be undergoing systemic failure at a speed that is simply not registered to our current monitoring system. An obvious example might be extinction events. A species might exist long after the point that it has essentially suffered systemic failure, perhaps due to its environment changing around it at a speed that it's unable to adapt to. Just because it's still here doesn't mean it's not actually gone. Coral reefs could perhaps represent this in the real world. The coral is bleached in a relatively short period of time, so short that it might be impossible for other organisms to respond to that change quickly enough to avoid the failure of the reef ecosystem. What should be of a significant concern to us as a species is the large number of systems that we depend on that are under significant pressure, and the high degree of connectivity between those systems. If a few systems fail, perhaps they all could. I'll now look a little bit more at some of the ideas around liquidity and complex networks, in particular how liquid are complex networks. If we look again at the example of a social network, most social networks will consist of relatively highly connected communities that are more loosely connected to other communities, bubbles or echo chambers, where we are highly connected to other individuals that tend to share our values, but more loosely connected to other groups of individuals. The emergent system that these communities represent might correlate with particular ideologies or political views. These emergent states could be relatively stable or exhibit a degree of quasi-stability. The system state is orbiting an attractor that keeps it roughly in the same area of a system or phase of space. The internal dynamics of these systems could be very fluid, individuals coming and going and connections changing, but the emergent state is quasi-stable or stable in the short term, by which I mean the ideas and ideology of the current system remain stable and circulates through the system. Or to put it another way, the system has memory that it infects new members to the community with, perpetuating those ideas. Perhaps it is not the individuals in a community that perpetuate the ideas and the ideology, but it's the system itself. Here the notion of systemic failure might meet liquidity in a slightly different way. Systemic failure could represent the point in time where the flow stops. To use the metaphor of the skater on the ice, the skater stops and the ice breaks. The community representing an ideology is an emergent property of a part of a social network, and it is dependent on the relatively tightly connected network of individuals that circulate those ideas repeatedly. The system is quasi-stable at the level of the emergent property, but fluid everywhere else. The financial crisis was also a liquidity crisis. Once the flow of money stopped, banks started to fail. Complexity theory offers little comfort in terms of concrete methodologies or tools for understanding the situation that we find ourselves in. However, it does offer concrete reasoning as to why perhaps we should be working harder to develop such tools and methodologies. What it is trying to do is develop a way to make interventions in complex systems that produce some sort of desired effect. Possibly not easy to do, but at least worth attempting.